want to get into my next topic, and that is the survival of Bitcoin. When you look at some strategies or some companies that are developing alternative coins and or alternative blockchain technology out there, what are your thoughts on potentially, could Bitcoin ever be replaced by some other crypto?
I think there's about zero chance of that.
Really?
Bitcoin's
Okay.
$1 trillion digital monetary network. Bitcoin would be the most successful thing you've ever seen in your life. Period.
That's a big one.
For example, it took Microsoft 44 years to be $1 trillion. It took Apple 42 years to be $1 trillion network. It took Amazon 24 years to be $1 trillion network. It took Google 22 years to be $1 trillion network. It took Bitcoin 12 years to become $1 trillion network. And there's nothing else.
Right.
There is no other $1 trillion network. So what you have is a decentralized digital network, which is in essence transforming analog money or analog assets to digital assets. It's global. It's running everywhere on the earth, and it has been growing. It was growing at 200% a year. Try to remember when Amazon or Apple or Google grew at 200% a year.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
It's growing at 200% a year for a decade until March of 2020. And in March of 2020, that monetary fire that was burning at 200% a year hit the pandemic, and the rate of currency expansion increased by a factor of 3. We went from expanding the money supply at 7% a year to expanding the money supply at 24% a year. We're looking at the money supply expanding at 15% a year or more for the next 4 to 8 years. So how do you feed a monetary fire? And the answer is you pour money on it.
Right.
And so the macroeconomics are driving this network to grow faster. The network, it accelerated. It was growing 200% a year. Now it's growing 400+% a year. Okay, again, give me an example of anything this scale that ever grew 400% a year. And in terms of inertia, the $1 trillion is $1 trillion of monetary energy. That means you've got more than 100 million people that have $1 trillion invested in this brand. This is the only brand in the history of the world. It's $1 trillion brand, right? It's like think about the value of Coca-Cola as the brand. In the minds of 100 million plus people, you have this idea and it's worth $1 trillion. How are you going to rip that idea out of people's heads? 100 million people, thousands and thousands of companies, huge amounts of energy, a huge amount of inertia. This is the base layer digital asset network that they're all focusing upon. And so as they build their technology around it, like Square and PayPal, and as they invest in it, like Tesla, and as the message spreads, that's a lot more energy and a lot more momentum than any company or any other brand or any other idea I've seen, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think the growth is definitely, unprecedented in terms of how it's happened. I think what some people are looking at, including companies like an Algorand, which, Vasily over there, his approach is to try to solve some of the issues that Bitcoin does have. If they were, or companies like him and like that group, were to be able to actually get into the layer of creating a crypto model that starts to be a little bit more decentralized, because his argument, I don't know if you've ever listened to him, he was on the Lex podcast here recently, and his argument was basically that Bitcoin is starting, even though it did start out as a decentralized mechanism, it's starting to centralize, like what most of all types of currency and or technology starts to do in terms of centralizing. You had mentioned ASICs, which is kind of the scenario of where this already, just because of pure hardware requirements to get into mining and starting to move into this, that it's naturally becoming a centralized potential currency. If it does become a more and more centralized currency, because this is still just 2021, we're talking 2030, 2040 here before we really could see the potential of this currency, it could be controlled by some nation states or potentially just a handful of miners. What are your thoughts on that?
I think 10,000 companies or 10,000 projects have attempted to displace Bitcoin. I think they've all failed.
Yeah.
The only way you're going to be successful with another crypto asset network is if you target a totally different use case than base treasury asset. So if it's a differentiated thing with a different market segment, a different use case, then perhaps. But in fact, the market has spoken. I'll say it again. In the history of the human race, we've never had a $1 trillion digital monetary network. It's the most successful thing humanity has created. It is creating value and gaining market adoption faster than anything that we can point our finger at in the history of the human race. So, there's 100,000 entrepreneurs that would like to be Google or like to displace Facebook or like to displace iOS, and they're all going to have this is a better thing. But at the end of the day, if you're staring at a $1 trillion network that is more successful than everything you've seen in your life, that's growing faster than anything on earth, that's being adopted everywhere in the world, and you're going to then opt to ignore it in favor of a project in somebody's garage. I mean, it just seems irrational. When the other thing is 10 times as big as Bitcoin doing the same exact thing, then maybe it's logical. But right now the market is spoken, right? Yeah. And if you don't actually accept Bitcoin, then what do you think about Facebook, Google, Apple, and Amazon? Because those things are growing much slower with much weaker network effects right now. Right. Bitcoin transcends any company, any CEO, any country. It's spreading everywhere, and it truly is the most successful decentralized technology human beings can point toward. Right. So I don't know what else you'd point toward in terms of decentralization other than this. So, well, I would say the other things they're ventures and they're attempting to do something, and to the extent that they do something unique, they may find a constituency. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think your point, right, is just that its capacity and its ability to compound on growth is just unmatched, and being able to go into that market at this point, especially at the state it's in right now, which is, astronomical, that's a pretty high ticket to cross over. With that being the case, Bitcoin, of course, in the last year has grown an exponential amount, and now to a magnitude. When you see this kind of growth, what is holding back, nation states and governments from converting to cryptocurrency, especially Bitcoin, as essentially their monetary system? Why not?
It's a $1 trillion network, and that makes it 1/10 the size of gold. Right. And so you're seeing it trading maybe $4, $5, $6 billion a day. Mm-hmm. So it's a suitable monetary network for a corporation or an individual that has a scale of investment in the billions or less. But if you wanted to store $10 to $100 billion, it's not quite big enough yet. Gotcha. And so there's a natural inertia. It takes a typical individual, it takes them 6 months from the point that they hear about Bitcoin to go through the educational process. And then from the point you decided you wanted to buy it, it would probably take you 12 weeks before you got comfortable with the on-ramp, the custodian, and the technique. Mm-hmm. For corporations, you double or triple that. Companies have corporate governance, they have compliance, they have board of directors. It would be certain companies, Tesla, they're lightning fast, but the typical company, they think that if they do something and it takes a year to get around to it, that was lightning fast. Yeah. So the natural adoption cycle is going to be private companies, mid-size, early adopter, technical forward-thinking public companies. Right. Then it will ripple. Normally, small or mid-sized countries, they're going to come last. I mean, before them will come big institutional investors, and then the very conservative institutional investors. The insurance companies have $7 trillion or something in assets, and so they'll probably be, 3 levels from now. I think insurance companies right now have about $1 billion worth of Bitcoin exposure that we know of. Right. And the next step would be for them to increase it by a factor of 10.
Sure.
But you can see, I mean, I wouldn't be holding my breath for the nation states first. I mean, nor do we really need to. This is a treasury asset.
Yeah.
And so this is the solution to there's 100 million companies in the world, and there's 5,000 mega public companies, and there's 10,000 institutional investors that have $1 billion worth of capital or more. And so this is a lot more interesting for any of them at this scale. And I would think that the adoption will go from this point from 1 trillion to 10 trillion, and then it'll creep up toward 100 trillion.
Right.
Somewhere between 10 and 100 trillion, you'll start to see small countries probably start to pay attention to it, but not right now. I mean, between 1 trillion and 10 trillion, this is like gold investors reallocating from gold, and silver investors reallocating from silver, and someone with a bunch of cash in a savings account saying, why don't I just put my money from a savings account into Bitcoin, and there's more than enough of that demand, for the near next 2, 3, 4 years.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk go and talk a little about other position here, and if you follow Mike Green at Logica Capital, what his position is, I'm sure you're aware of it. He kind of looks at it as almost a detriment to our own government, is that this is potentially a problem because of countries like China and Russia being so involved in Bitcoin mining and also Bitcoin in general. His position that this is very dangerous for the U.S. government to even allow. What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think a lot of people were against the automobile and electricity when it came out. Bitcoin is 21st century financial technology. It's $1 billion block of energy, manifested as sunlight. You can move it at the speed of light. You can program it. If you want to build a 21st century economy, you're going to need to embrace technology. It's not at all a bad thing for America to lead in the financial technology segment in the 21st century. And so dismissing Bitcoin is kind of like just dismissing any new technology. I mean, you could say the same thing about the internet.
Done that.
People get worried about new technologies, and I mean, there are people that thought that pagers were tools of criminals, right? And then there were mobile phones might be used for something, and I think in this particular case, you have the ability to put a block of $1 billion on a computer and do 1 million transactions a second and move it at the speed of light. And that means that you can revolutionize the banking industry. You can revolutionize the savings account. You can create much more efficient counterparty transactions in the finance sector. Like the way I get loans right now is I fill out a personal financial statement. My accountant at 20 years gives it to my banker at 15 years, 3 months after the end of the year on paper, and they submit it. And on the basis of that, the bank decides whether to give me a loan.
Sure.
That's literally 19th century technology.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I could post a simple wallet address or set up a computer program where the bank could verify every second of the day, 24/7, 365, mark to market the value of the collateral.
Yep.
You're talking about something which is 1 million times more transparent, 1 million times more efficient. So if you want to go back to the 19th century or stay stuck in the 19th century, or in this case, the 20th century, then you ignore this. But I think you ignored at your own peril. I mean, it's pretty clear that the nation is going to find a way to come to terms with technology. I mean, we may put some kind of KYC, AML regulations around it. I mean, we do that with a lot of things, but it is technology, and once you've created it, we're either going to master it and use it for the United States to lead in the 21st century, or we're going to let some other country master it, and we're going to fall behind.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine this, had this been the case with the internet, had we shut it down or not implemented the strategies that essentially the U.S. really was behind in terms of the science behind what DARPA was trying to do when they created, basically what we have now in terms of the internet. So yeah, you're exactly right. You're mentioning loans and kind of this movement toward financial transactions a lot in this interview. talking about that there's several companies out there that are riding on the blockchain right now, whether you're looking at companies like BlockFi or someone like Celsius. What are your thoughts on these companies who are leveraging the coins to essentially go out into the market, do transactions in terms of loans, give you loans on the other side? What are your thoughts on those companies and how they might fare?
I think that the success of BlockFi and Celsius is going to draw the other banks into this, and I think it's inevitable that the big banks, the JP Morgan, the Morgan Stanley, they're going to want to enter this space in order to keep their customers. I think there's two dynamics here. One is, if you look at any asset class like automobiles and houses, there are countries where you can't borrow money to buy a car. And there are countries, it used to be in Mexico, you couldn't borrow money to buy a house. Well, that's in that situation, the industry isn't very well developed. At the point that you can start to borrow money and finance the house and the car, demand explodes. And the same is, so on one side, as you can borrow money to own Bitcoin, or you can borrow money against Bitcoin, demand's going to explode. It's going to mature as an asset class. And on the other side, that's going to draw the banks into this because they can't afford to ignore it. But we're still early, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
it is very early.
Like this decade is the decade when we'll see which bank decides to get into it, and there will be some banks that don't. There'll be some banks that do, that handle the asset class. The ones that do are going to grow. The ones that don't are not going to grow.
And there's some arguments out there on the banking system itself that it potentially could be completely replaced with a lot of these new fintech startups. Is there any particular, brick and mortar bank that you see today that could make that digital leap that you would say, hey, I have a little bit of faith in this particular bank?
Look, I think the nimble fintechs, the Square and PayPal are nimble. They're going to kick the less nimble fintechs, the Google, the Apple, to think. And then you've got the nimble banks, the Celsius and the BlockFi, and they're going to tweak the less nimble banks. And, some will get a little bit in, like Morgan Stanley announced they're going to offer a Bitcoin fund through their financial advisors. But that's like just dipping their toe in it. Like, it's really anybody's market to have or not have, depending upon how progressive. And I think it's reasonable to say some large traditional institutions will get in, but many will not. And some big tech companies will join and others will not. And that's what makes the market competition exciting to watch, right?
No doubt, and I think you're right. There's going to be some big winners here. This is going to kind of explode what I think could be an entirely new evolution of startups around fintech, and I'm getting very excited about them. I've had a chance to kind of break down Celsius and BlockFi both. Even though there are some challenges with that, with FDIC, insurance, and being able to get enough, especially if you're going in with a large amount of money going into these companies, going in that direction. When they get some sort of security blanket in those organizations, I think that definitely explodes the opportunity for them, for sure. Because I know a lot of people that are, they're sitting on $1 million in cash. They're just sitting there, well, I have to put it in different banks right now just to be able to keep it secured. So when you're getting into those kind of scenarios, it definitely plays a part.
Yeah, the banking and the on-ramps do matter. I mean, some people do business with a bank and they've been doing business with the same bank for 30 years. And then when they start thinking about Bitcoin, like, how do I buy it? It takes like 6 months or a year to get comfortable. And then like, well, how do I borrow against it? And that's like another year of thinking and worrying. So you've got a 1 to 3 year impedance. On the other hand, if JP Morgan or Citigroup just said, oh yeah, we'll buy $1 million of it for you and we'll give you a loan at LIBOR plus 300 basis points. It would go from taking 3 months of agonizing with 5 people huddled in a room to like 5 minutes on the phone with your broker. And so that is, it is a dynamic and it's occurring right in front of our eyes.